Many Republican voters will tell you that they feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. That's a very threatening thing. That's not just disagreeing over tax policy or disagreeing over over health reform. This is feeling like your country is being taken from you. And so that's what I think the best scholarship that I've seen on American politics suggests is at the root of this polarization. Now, it's exacerbated by income inequality.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective addressing important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'll be your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, this is how liberty dies. Are we witnessing the end of liberal democracy as we know it? I'd like to explore how republics and democratic societies fail. You may recall from the Star Wars series, Senator Padme Amidala's famous quote as the Emperor is elected for life. This is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. Could the USA, the bastion of freedom and democracy, fall to tyranny? This is particularly relevant today, I think, when the populist leader of the most prominent bastion of liberal democracy is floating a delayed election in response to the COVID-19 epidemic, inciting his followers to violence against protesters, and boosting QAnon conspiracy theories that cast his opponents as pedophiles who eat children. What are the similarities between our seemingly unique situation and the fall of other democratic societies? In this episode, to get to the bottom of this question, I've decided to interview one of the authors of the best-selling book, How Democracies Die, to get his input on the current troubling situation in the U.S. As always, if you enjoy my content, please hit like. Please follow me and subscribe on your podcast app. Provide a comment. I'd love to hear your feedback. And share this episode with your friends. If you want responses from me, feel free to join my Facebook page at Al Scott Rational. Now today, I'm welcoming Professor Stephen R. Levitsky to the podcast. Dr. Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, mostly in Latin America. He is co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, published in 2018, which was a New York Times bestseller and has been published in 22 languages. He is also the author of many books regarding politics and authoritarianism in Latin America. He is currently writing a book with Luc Anouilh on the durability of revolutionary regimes. Dr. Levitsky has also written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Vox, The New Republic, and The Monkey Cage, and he has written regular columns in La República of Peru and Folha do Sao Paulo in Brazil. Dr. Levitsky, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks. It's good to meet you.
Good to meet you as well, and thanks for coming on my show.
Happy to be here.
Could you please tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in Latin American governments?
I got interested in Latin America because during the when I was growing up, my high school and college years, Central America were front page. It was a front page set of issues in the United States. This was the mid 1980s. There had just been a revolution in Nicaragua. There were civil wars going on in Guatemala and El Salvador, and the U.S. was centrally involved in those. So I got involved initially as an activist, as a critic of the Reagan administration's policies in Central America. And from there, went to college, took a couple of classes, had an opportunity to travel to Central America, and just fell in love with Latin America 30 years ago and still going.
Very interesting. So in this interview, I'd like to explore your book, How Democracies Die, where you explore the current state of the U.S. political system. I'd like to understand what parallels do you see between the current state of U.S. politics and historical failures of democracy?
There are a number of parallels you could draw. I think the most important, the most central one is the consequences of extreme polarization. We know that one of the things that kills democracy, not a huge number of established democracies have died in the world. You can count on a couple of hands the number of really well-established democracies that have broken down. But looking around, Uruguay in the early 1970s, Chile in the early 1970s, Spain and Germany, they were not really very established democracies, but European democracies that broke down in the 30s, almost all of them were ripped apart by extreme polarization. And that is something that has kind of surprised scholars here in the United States, but polarization has gotten quite extreme over the last 10, 15 years in the US.
This is one of the things I made this podcast for, is to combat what I see as a growing polarization between two different sides, especially in the online social media debate. It's become a circus of throwing barbs and weaponized memes back and forth without really engaging. And I think this engagement from both sides of an issue is the lifeblood of democracy. I feel like the systemic inequality and income inequality that we're seeing that has built up over the years are driving unrest in the civilized world. I see a loss of hope and the rise of nihilism on both sides of the divide. There's violent protests, there's extremist nutcases who just want to watch the world burn. People that feel disenfranchised in society just seem to want to break the system. Why are people so highly polarized today?
That is a great question. And I think that you pointed to one of them. You pointed to income inequality, which is income inequality and income inequality has increased and social mobility has declined considerably. The ability of people to, really for the first time in anybody's living memory, people's kids don't have the same prospects that they had, which in the United States is almost unthinkable. This rise in inequality is observable across the Western industrialized world. It's worse in the U.S. than in some European social democracies, but it's a common factor across the industrialized West. I think another factor, though, and almost certainly more important in the U.S. is race and the response to growing racial diversity and racial equality. The polarization, the partisan polarization in the United States, most scholars of U.S. politics trace its origins to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, mid-60s, which began the partisan realignment, which began to shift Southern conservative voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that sort of began the process of polarization. There is almost no class difference in the vote anymore between Democrats and Republicans, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. There's virtually no difference in the income level of the average voter. The Trump voter was slightly wealthier than the average Clinton voter, but it's a very weak relationship. What the real distinguishing factor between Democrats and Republicans these days is race and culture. If you are white, not college educated, and religious, you're almost certain to be Republican. If you are urban, secular, and non-white, you're almost certain to be Democrat. And the reason that's polarizing, it doesn't have to be polarizing, but the reason it's polarizing, I think, is that we're going through a really distinctive, almost unique phenomenon or process in the United States, which is that a previously dominant ethnic group or previously dominant cultural group is losing its majority status in two senses. It's losing its electoral majority, it's losing its numerical majority, but it's also losing its dominant status in society. And that's a really threatening thing. Many Republican voters will tell you that they feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. That's a very threatening thing. That's not just disagreeing over tax policy or disagreeing over over health reform. This is feeling like your country is being taken from you. And so that's what I think the best scholarship that I've seen on American politics suggests is at the root of this polarization. Now, it's exacerbated by income inequality. If we had policies in place that allowed for those who are losing their dominant social status had a future. Their kids had a future. They had decent jobs. They could aspire to gain something in the years to come. I think they'd be less angry. They'd be less prone to the kind of nihilistic attitudes that you pointed to.
People like to find a scapegoat to blame, and that helps these authoritarians rise to power to exploit that hatred, the angst that people are feeling about losing their country.
So it's both social mobility, but also inequality. I mean, blue state elites are living in an utterly different world, right? We didn't really suffer the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Our incomes continued to boom. We have, cultural tastes and material tastes that are completely out of line with the rest of the country, and that generates resentment as well. So that's another element of inequality.
Now, hopping to another issue. In Canada, we have an unelected Senate. It's become, over the years, a purely partisan appointment by the Prime Minister. And people are pushing in Canada to abolish this Senate or reform it and make it responsive to the electorate, make it an elected body like in the U.S. And in the U.S., many people feel that the Electoral College, for example, is undemocratic. Yet in your book, you defend the role of unelected bodies as gatekeepers in defending democracy and keeping out authoritarians. And this seems counterintuitive. Could you expand on that, please?
Well, we're not big fans of the Electoral College. I think the Electoral College has become the Electoral College served its design purpose for about 4 years in U.S. history. It almost immediately became a useless, essentially vestigial element, something that just existed but didn't really have a purpose and wasn't very consequential either way. But it's now become consequential because it is a distinctly counter-majoritarian and even anti-majoritarian institution. I should be very clear, this is not the Republican Party's fault, but the Republican Party benefits enormously from the Electoral College. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated states. It's a slight bias, but it's a real bias. And for most of American history, that didn't matter because both parties had urban and rural wings. Both parties had, among their base, sparsely populated territories. Only in the last 20 years, really the last 10 or 15 years, the parties have become divided over on the urban-rural dimension. The Republicans are the party of sparsely populated territories, and the Democrats are the party of the big cities. The issue with that is it gives a multi-point advantage to the Republican Party in presidential elections. So it's now becoming, there is a pretty significant chance that Donald Trump loses the popular vote by a healthy margin this year and yet wins the presidency again. That is going to have to deal a body blow to the legitimacy of our electoral system. Mm-hmm. You'll see more of those nihilists in the streets. So the Electoral College, I think, is not the right gatekeeper. The gatekeeper that Ziblatt and I point to is political parties. Okay. And political parties are elected. Political parties put their candidates up for office. And the leaders of political parties, those who we argue ought to be selecting the candidates, are generally elected officials. So this is not some unelected body.
Okay, good.
But we do think that it is useful to have experienced politicians have a say in the selection of candidates.
And in the past, you feel that this selection of candidates by the elected party leaders has stopped authoritarians from getting candidacies and getting to the presidency like we have now.
It's had a perfect record. Now, the way that American parties selected candidates prior to 1972, basically the old smoke-filled back room in the convention, had all sorts of serious problems. It was not transparent. It wasn't very democratic. Turns out it wasn't very inclusionary either. It was, basically a bunch of pretty well-connected white guys. And so there were real limitations to the old system, and it really did need to be reformed. But that system had a perfect record in keeping demagogues out. For better and worse, it had a perfect record in keeping out demagogues. In part because these guys know the candidates. They know, the closest parallels to Trump that we could find probably in U.S. history were Henry Ford, who was a very wealthy, kind of eccentric figure, very, very popular, especially in the Midwest. Thought about running for president in 1924, but it became very clear that the parties were not going to nominate him. Political party elites were not going to nominate him, for better or worse. He was, pretty anti-Semitic and dallied with fascist ideas, so I think it's a pretty good idea that he was not, that he was effectively screened out. The other guy is George Wallace, who came a little closer to the presidency than Henry Ford, but again, couldn't get near, had to run as a third-party candidate in 8 in order to compete, because he wasn't going to be able to get any major party nomination.
So the U.S. has been a bastion of freedom and democracy for centuries, and many people feel that the U.S. Could not be at risk of becoming autocratic, that it's special, that the Constitution, the way it's set up, makes it impossible for this to happen. What's your feeling on this? Is the U.S. special?
The system is set up pretty well. The system is set up to prevent some failures, but not others, right? There are many ways to die. There are many ways to become dysfunctional. And so our system is set up pretty brilliantly in a variety of ways, but it's not set up, for example, to deal with highly disciplined, polarized parties. Our system of checks and balances cannot function well with two parties that are highly polarized and purely disciplined, because it's basically set up our system of two houses of Congress and the need to get legislation through the executive in both houses. It must be the case that the parties can either come together and compromise, or that individual members of the parties float and cross the aisle. But two highly polarized parties that can't get along, can't work together, cannot make a system of a U.S. style checks and balances system work. Now, your earlier point about is the U.S. special, is the U.S. sort of invulnerable? I think that's one of the dangers, is that all of us, myself included, and I study this for a living, if you'd asked us 5 years ago, all of us took U.S. democracy for granted. We took the stability of U.S. democracy for granted. We figured that no matter how recklessly we voted, no matter how recklessly we behaved, no matter how recklessly our politicians behaved, they couldn't possibly break American democracy. That seemed impossible. And look, there's some social science behind that. We know two things in political science, at least empirically. Old democracies never die, and rich democracies never die. The breakdown rate of both old and rich democracies is close to zero. But so the question is, are we in new terrain? And I think there's some reason to think that we are. Levels of inequality, as you pointed out at the beginning, are higher than any time since before the Great Depression. And this phenomenon that I pointed to of a once dominant ethnic majority losing its dominant status is also new and pretty unprecedented. There's not a democracy in history that's gone through that transition. So I actually think that we are in new terrain. I think there's nothing. The United States is a rich, powerful country with a pretty distinctive political culture, but there's nothing unique about the United States. All the patterns that we see in the U.S. can be found elsewhere.
You mentioned in your book that several norms of the U.S. government system, long-standing unwritten rules, have been violated recently by both parties. The Republican governor of Georgia, for example, acted as chief elections officer in his own election. Is that even legal? So, and gerrymandering, I learned in high school that was something that would not be allowed in a functioning democracy, and yet it seems to be common practice in the U.S. Can you tell me, where this is headed?
Yeah, well, if I knew where this was headed, I would have a much better paying job. But look, the U.S. is, because it's such an old democracy, and because it's been stable for so long, and because we could take so much of it for granted, and because our parties weren't very polarized, and so therefore the stakes in politics were relatively low. we rely a ton on informal norms, or to put it another way, on the self-restraint of politicians. If you look at Brazilian democracy or German democracy, or really any democracy that was born in the 20th or 21st century, they're likely to have a slew of rules, of formal rules that very clearly and formally constrain behavior. That say elections are run like this and this and this, and politicians are allowed to do X and Y. They're not allowed to do Z, A, B. The U.S. doesn't have much of that. We have a very small, very short, limited constitution. We have a very decentralized polity, and we actually don't have a large number of rules stating you can't do that. And we have survived, and this goes back a long way in history. Just to give one example, it wasn't until the 1940s that we took seriously the idea of a formal two-term limit in the presidency. Anybody could have been president for life, just like Hugo Chavez, until 1947. But after George Washington, we went 150 years, and no politician went for the third term. The point is that our system relies not on the rules that say you can't do this, but politicians restraining themselves. It's actually pretty easy to in some localities to stuff ballot boxes, to commit fraud. We now know it's very easy to get away with all sorts of conflicts of interest in the presidency, to make a ton of money out of the presidency. We know that it's possible to pardon your friends. It's possible to have people do criminal work for you, and then you turn around and pardon them. There's no rules against this stuff, or the rules are ambiguous. We relied on self-restraint. And so all it took was, one, a highly polarized polity, which gets people into sort of a any means necessary mentality, because you hate the other guy so much you're willing to pull out all the stops to beat them. So both parties are in this sort of win at all cost, any means necessary mode of thinking. And secondly, a politician or an individual like Trump, who never met a norm he wasn't willing to break. If there's one thing that characterizes Donald Trump, it's an absence of self-restraint. And so you put somebody in power who doesn't give a crap about norms, who does not restrain himself, who will use the letter of the law to the max whenever he can. And suddenly our system, which seemed to work so well for 200 plus years, looks like it's a mess.
Yeah. Wow. And you mentioned in your book the Republicans had violated a long-standing government norm by blocking Obama's right to appoint a Supreme Court judge. And this had not happened before in the history of the United States.
It did. It happened right after the Civil War. It hadn't happened since 1860.
Okay. But the courts still seem independent. You see that the Trump's 2016 campaign team, for example, have all been indicted by courts. So this is a hopeful sign that the courts are still willing to stand up. However, any significant challenges will now end up at a Supreme Court that's been stacked with Republican nominees. I can foresee electoral improprieties in the upcoming election being ignored by the top court. Is this likely?
Well, that's the big question. So, look, the U.S. has U.S. democracy is hard to kill, right? We're sliding into crisis. We've experienced backsliding in some ways, but the United States still has a number of really strong institutions, federal institutions, and state agencies where we still continue to have a number of professionals doing their job, regardless of who appointed them. And as you pointed out, the courts, the judiciary continues to be highly professional and quite independent. This is not to say that, in 4, 8, or 12 years, this couldn't be eroded, but thus far, you're right. We still have a fair amount of judicial independence. Big question will come. We now have there's now a perception, among at least in half the country, that we have a a Supreme Court with a 5-4 majority that was effectively stolen. The court does not have the same legitimacy that it had, for example, in 2000, when we had an electoral dispute that was decided by the Supreme Court. That was a ruling that for Democrats really sucked. It was disputed. It was disputable. It may well have been the fact that there was a 5-4 conservative majority that it went to Bush, but Americans accepted that ruling in part because Al Gore accepted the ruling, but in part because it was still a pretty legitimate Supreme Court, conservative or not. The way that those 9 individuals got there was widely viewed to be clean, legitimate, and so we all, as a society, accepted that ruling, even those who didn't like it. I think 2020 is probably a different game. We're facing a situation where there's a good chance that one or more states will have disputes. There's a good chance that Trump will not behave like Gore, that he won't accept defeat, that he'll claim fraud. There's a good chance it ends up in the courts because that's really the U.S. doesn't have a set of established electoral authorities to deal at the national level with electoral disputes, so it will end up in the court. What if it's a 5-4 ruling in favor of Trump? I don't know how legitimate that's going to appear. Now, Roberts, to his credit, seems to take very seriously the reputation and the integrity of the Supreme Court. He's obviously conservative, but his vote is not assured. So one could also imagine a dispute that ends up 5-4 in favor of Biden with Roberts joining the liberals. So it's certainly not a guarantee. This is not a court that is so packed that we know automatically in advance how it'll rule. But if there's a 5-4 ruling for Trump after the theft of Merrick Garland's seat, or the seat that he was nominated for, that's going to be another body blow to the legitimacy of our institutions. Again, our democracy will not die quickly. It's way too strong for that. But we've suffered a series of blows over the last 5 years that have weakened it. And if we have a severe electoral crisis in 2020, which is entirely possible, that will be another major blow.
Yeah, and now you see that the Republican regime are suggesting delaying elections because of COVID.
Well, Trump said that. That seems less likely.
Good. So we've seen the president adopting a strategy to call into question the legitimacy of mail-in balloting, to question the full electoral process, and to it seems to be obstructing the U.S. Postal Service to try and suppress the vote effectively. And this may be leading to another Supreme Court challenge.
Yeah.
That's somewhat frightening. The situation that we see from Canada is scary. We see, these protests going on. We see violence. We see secret police abducting political opponents in unmarked vehicles. We see norm breaking and anti-democratic signaling. If this were a small Central American country, the U.S. would be invading by now to restore order. As a Canadian, this is worrying. Should we invade?
Fine. It's very worrisome. I think you shouldn't invade because I think in the medium to long run, the prospects to consolidate a dictatorship on either side are very low. I think that the Republicans, there's a good chance that they create a hell of a crisis in 2020. There's some chance that Trump is able to sort of steal this election broadly defined, particularly through the mail and the vote by mail process, right? If that gets difficult, and it's very clear, at least surveys show, that Democrats are disproportionately the ones who are voting by mail and Republicans in person. So if 10% or 15 or 20% of the ballots by mail end up not counting, they don't get there in time because the post office was slowed, they were ill-prepared to deal with the influx of ballots. They're not filled out correctly, so they're discarded. And if we lose 10, 20% of the mail-in votes, which is possible, and Democrats are overwhelmingly represented among mail-in votes, Biden could be ahead by 6 points on the day before the election, lose the election. I mean, and there's no smoking gun illegality there either. So there are scenarios where Trump could, even though he's clearly behind, let's say 6, 7, 8 points, somehow wins the election or retains presidency, which would put us in a borderline authoritarian situation in the short term. I think in the medium term, those guys, the Republicans, don't have the distribution of power in American society doesn't favor them. The military, unlike Latin America, the region that I study, the military is not going to weigh in on the side of the Republicans. Increasingly, the bulk of the most important, the most dynamic capital in the country is actually sympathetic to the Democrats. The numbers favor the Democrats. Most of the media is at least not particularly either independent or more favorable to the Democrats. So it's that underlying balance of power makes a scenario like Hungary or Turkey or Venezuela or Russia really hard to fathom. There's just too many numbers, too much money, too much cultural capital, too much organization in the opposition. The Democrats may not win the 2020 election, but they are a very strong opposition by comparative standards, which I think means that we're likely not headed into long-term dictatorship or fascism. What we may be headed into, and which could affect Canadians, is just dysfunctionality. I mean, we're not able to function. I mean, nowhere is this clearer than in the response to COVID-19, right? Our society and our government at the federal level couldn't deal. We just couldn't deal with COVID-19. We couldn't respond effectively. We're the only rich democracy on earth that couldn't respond minimally effectively to COVID-19. And so, you guys share a big border with us, so our dysfunctionality may, no joking aside, may have real consequences.
Indeed. And you mentioned in your book that we should be on the lookout for a crisis that could be used to strengthen an authoritarian leader. Now, the COVID crisis would have seemed to be ideal for that, but it has not done that due to the fact that it was somewhat fumbled. Should we expect the government to foment a new crisis in the coming months before the election?
There are some very smart people in the United States who are worried about that, who are worried about a war between now and November. One advantage we small d Democrats have in the case of Trump is he's a pretty inept autocrat. He's not very smart. He's not very experienced. He lacks anything in the way of discipline, and he lacks organization. If we had Viktor Orban or Erdogan or Putin or Hugo Chavez in the presidency of the United States, they would do much more damage, I think, than Trump.
Yeah, I agree. He's not as scary as some of these other autocrats who inspire this blind, give your life kind of loyalty. I don't think Trump's charisma goes that far.
But he doesn't plan. He's not disciplined. He's never on message. It's hard for him to develop and implement any kind of a plan or even a strategy. And I think that's weakened him. And I think that, and to the benefit of democracy. So I think that makes a well thought out, planned crisis, which is a high risk strategy, right? It's a very risky strategy. I think it makes it less likely. I think it's going to be hard for him, without leaks, without mistakes, to plan, let's say, a war in Iran. I think it's more likely that he'll try to create chaos or allow. I mean, it's a phenomenon that I call malign neglect. I mean, you're right. He didn't use COVID as an excuse like Orban did in Hungary to shut down Congress or to concentrate power.
or Trudeau in Canada.
But he's allowed COVID to create crisis, right? I mean, there may well be cities where the infection is rampant on election day, and we rely in the United States largely on retirees as volunteers to man the polling places. In cities where the infection is rampant, people aren't going to show up. They're going to have to close down polling places. This happened in some of the primaries. I think Trump is relying on, we call it, Ziblatt and I call it malign neglect, that a crisis hits, a number of steps need to be taken to protect people's health and to protect the vote, right? If we're going to vote, we need to prepare, we need to invest ahead of time to ensure that everybody can vote by mail in a pandemic, or to ensure that people can vote safely in person. The government presumably knew that and basically did nothing because they're betting on chaos. They're betting on a chaotic, low turnout election. I think that, and I think if there's any October surprise that Trump is going to try to pull off, it may be a vaccine, a rollout of a vaccine. But there are people worried about a war.
Now, you mentioned in your book that the Republican Party is mainly responsible for eroding the norms of democracy, especially under Donald Trump. Yet you argue that the Democrats should be taking the high road and not striking back in tit-for-tat fashion. Is this a road to recovery?
We don't know. It's a tough question. We get a lot of pushback for that part of our argument. The truth is, and I've talked to members of the opposition in a number of countries that are in similar places, similar situations. The opposition in Turkey, the opposition in Hungary, the opposition in Venezuela, the opposition in Peru when Fujimori was in power in the 90s. When you have an elected leader or an elected party that breaks the rules and sort of is the first mover in stepping away from democracy, the opposition is left with a very difficult set of choices. It's really fundamentally in a lose-lose situation. So either you continue to play by the norms to protect the institutions, and you get rolled, you get steamrolled, or you fight back. You put your boxing gloves on, you fight back, maybe breaking the rules, maybe twisting the rules, maybe using violence, civil disobedience, and two things can happen. One, that radicalism can be used as an excuse to crack down further, because remember, they're the guys with the guns, not you, or not us in opposition. And that happened in Venezuela. The Venezuelan opposition, the very first years of Chavez, before he'd even done much, tried to organize a coup against him, tried to bring him down via mass protest, a general strike. They tried to just shut him down before he'd even gotten halfway through his presidency. And that was an excuse for him to crack down, to accelerate the crackdown. The other thing that fighting back dirty can do is just accelerate the process of decline. So if you've got a strong democracy that you could lose, that is still sort of hanging there, and you could lose, fighting dirty could just accelerate the loss. And that's why Ziblatt and I thought, given the strength of U.S. institutions, given how difficult it is to rebuild those institutions once you lose them, as long as there's a viable institutional channel, courts, first of all, elections, secondly, that the opposition should use those channels. We calculated, and I think it's still right. I mean, I may be proven wrong on November 4th, 2020, but our calculation was the Democrats still had the least bad option is to play by the rules and win by the rules. And that avenue, that channel still exists in the United States. So if Biden wins the presidency and the Democrats win control of the Senate, that's not going to be a panacea for American democracy by a long shot. But that will be a major step towards resolving the imminent crisis of our democracy. And I think that's still a viable option. As long as it's a viable option, the least bad strategy is to play institutionally.
So this has been a great discussion. But listeners out there are wondering, what can I do? I think people want to know, how can they help preserve the democracy? People don't want violence. People don't want collapse of democracy. People don't like giving in to the autocrats. What can people safely do to preserve democracy and move forward respectfully?
There are short and medium term answers to that. And Americans have done a lot. I mean, it's really worth pointing out that ever since that a lot has happened since 2016. As much as from the perspective of the opposition, as much as Trump has gotten away with, he's also been stymied quite a bit. The level of activism and protest, not just the George Floyd protest, but before then, the level of organization, both electoral and non-electoral, has increased considerably since 2016. Many Americans have gotten involved in politics. They've joined groups of various types and become active, and it's had an impact. Again, we are an electoral democracy, so the primary source of power continues to be elections. The 2018 election was a very important election. It was a major setback for Trump. It gave the House to the opposition party. And my colleague Theda Skocpol has been studying 4 communities in the heartland ever since 2016. And she finds, particularly among middle-aged, middle-class women, a major upsurge in political participation. Organizing, running campaigns, getting into politics, running for office, a big burst of energy. And so part of the answer is Americans are already doing it. They felt they were scared, they were appalled, and they got involved. Secondly, obviously people have to vote. It's harder this year to vote because of the pandemic. It's harder to vote because in many states Republicans are making it harder to vote. But voting and making sure other people have the opportunity, the ability to vote is really critical. I think in the medium term, the U.S. has to take steps to democratize the democracy. We have to take steps to make it much, much easier to vote. The fact that less than half the country votes in midterm elections and maybe 57, 58% vote in presidential elections is abominable. And we've got to pass legislation that makes it much easier to register, much easier to vote, and that gives every American an equal opportunity to do that. So it's not just easier for people like me to vote than it is for people who, say, don't have a driver's license. That's an obvious step in terms of democracy. Broadly speaking, there are 2 coalitions in the United States that are almost at war with one another. There is what Ron Brownstein calls a restorationist coalition, which is essentially the white Christian base that's losing its majority and is fighting tooth and nail to hold on to it. And there is what Brownstein calls a cosmopolitan coalition, which is this sort of weird conglomeration of everybody else. Urban people, educated white folks, secular voters, and a wide range of non-white voters. And that coalition is a majority. It's, to be somewhat arbitrary, it's about 53% of the country. It's having trouble winning national power because of the way that it's distributed geographically, because of the electoral system, because of the electoral college. The courts are starting to be stacked against that cosmopolitan majority. But our democracy really requires that majority come to power. And expanding voting, creating a situation where 75% of the country is voting rather than 55% would speed up that process, would enhance our ability to get to some semblance of majority rule. Right now, we're being governed by the 43% that Trumpism represents.
Yeah, definitely. I like your point about activating these groups that have previously not been active in the democratic process. That's really good that, these people that have not been empowered are now waking up and getting involved. I think one of my tenets is that the price of democracy is a well-informed and active populace. And if you're not doing that, then you're going to let your democracy go to whoever is willing to mobilize the resources. And I'm also concerned that the reason that we're in this situation that we are, and that we've gotten lazy and things have declined, is that politicians have continually tried to grab power, and this is happening on both sides of the political spectrum. We have politicians that have demonized expertise and knowledge, and have demonized the press, and have tried to control the message. And I think that's eroding one of the central pillars of democracy. So it's good and bad. It's good that people are becoming involved, and it's bad that they're becoming involved because things seem to be going south on us.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. We are suffering. This is one of the reasons why we failed so badly on the COVID-19 front, is the vilification of expertise. But that is populism. That's classic populism, and the Republican Party has, under Trump, become, even before Trump, but under Trump, it has really consolidated itself as a populist party, in the sense that it is an anti-elite political party. It's a party that mobilizes people by railing against the elite. And the elite, it can mean Wall Street, it can mean politicians, and it can mean public health experts. It means college professors like me, and it means journalists. And the Republican Party, increasingly, its message is, don't believe any of those guys. They're all out to get you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And which is dangerous, as you pointed out.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting discussion. I really appreciate you joining me here on The Rational View and providing your expert feedback on your book, How Democracies Die. Thank you very much for joining me on the show, Dr. Levitsky. And do you have any parting comments for our listeners?
Just tell Canadians to hold off on their invasion at least till after November 3rd. Give us one more chance.
Okay, I'll let the Prime Minister know to hold back. Thank you again, Dr. Levitsky.
Sure, it's great to be on the program. Take care.
Thank you. That was Dr. Stephen Levitsky, co-author of How Democracies Die. Thank you for listening to The Rational View. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page and becoming a patron of this podcast at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView.